I can safely say that, as a longtime fan who's played every entry in the series since Gyaktan Saibon in the original GBA, all the way to Spirit of Justice on the 3DS, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is probably the best game to come out in this franchise since Trials and Tribulations way back in 2004. Am I saying that every game released since that time has been a disappointment? Not at all. Every game since Trials and Tribulations has made leaps and bounds in terms of implementing new features and improving graphics. What I am saying, however, is that the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is the first game that manages to tell an engaging saga from beginning to end, the likes of which hasn't been seen since the ending of the original Phoenix Wright trilogy. I've actually played the original Japanese 3DS release of Dai Gyaktan Saibon when it came out on the 3DS, but my machine died during the last case, so I never got the chance to finish it. So color me surprised when almost 6 years later, a full graphical revamped version of the game comes out internationally on Steam, finally giving me a chance to experience what I couldn't before, and thank the high heavens it did, because this game is a banger, especially on a giant monitor as opposed to the tiny 3DS screen. Is the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles perfect? Of course not. There are a couple of things I thought could have been a bit better. I like the fact that voice acting existed. I wasn't a fan of the actual voice acting. I thought the first game is honestly pretty slow. Some of the cases feel like filler, meant to fill the 5 case limit and so on. Even with all that said though, it doesn't change the fact that the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles manages to bring in such a satisfying conclusion that both matches up and even surpasses the original trilogy in some ways. It sets up a great build-up that leads the way into one of the most exciting climaxes I've ever seen in the Ace Attorney series, taking it to new heights. Outside of the final trial, it also introduces several new gameplay features that really spruce up the game from a visual and gameplay perspective. Mob Trials makes a return from Phoenix Wright vs. Professor Layton, except revamped into the jury system. More exciting than that, however, is the logic and reasoning spectacular with Sherlock Holmes, which is absolutely filled with dynamic movement and pan-ins to make even the most menial corrections incredibly exciting. Naruhodo Ryunosuke's adventure in Great Britain is a story that I feel, along with a new setting and main character, breathes fresh air into a franchise that I've really loved all these years. If the Ace Attorney series has ever been something you've considered playing before, there has never been a more perfect entry to jump into. I do plan on covering some spoiler details near the end, which I have highlighted in video chapters to the right or the bottom, in case you haven't played it yet and this look at it convinces you to give it a shot. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles follows the story of Naruhodo Ryunosuke, a Japanese student during the Meiji period. He and his friend Asogi Kazuma travel to Great Britain in the hopes of studying law. However, in the wake of a tragic accident involving his best friend, Ryunosuke is instead accompanied by Mikotaba Susato to Great Britain in the hopes of continuing Kazuma's dream. However, underneath the bustling empire that is Great Britain lies a great darkness, one that Ryunosuke, with the help of Sherlock Holmes, would confront one way or another. Before I really get into the thick of things, let me give a very quick overview of the series in case anyone hasn't played or heard of the Ace Attorney series. Ace Attorney is a visual novel adventure game series, with the main character being a defense attorney who has to defend his clients. Gameplay is separated into investigation sections where the player meets the clients, investigates the crime scenes, and collect evidence, because even though this should normally be the detective's job, apparently we gotta do it ourselves. Outside of the investigation sections is the actual lawyer part of the game, where you cross-examine witnesses and present evidence that contradicts the statements shown. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles mixes up both of these gameplay sections. The biggest and most bombastic new feature, the one that really makes Dai Gyaktan Saibon shine, and gives so much life to the investigation phase, is the logic and reasoning spectacular courtesy of Sherlock Holmes. Speaking of which, I have no idea why the English version of the game calls him Sherlock Holmes, considering that the original Japanese was just straight up Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes is pretty much public domain for the most part, but I guess it's just a weird quirk. I'm still gonna call him Sherlock Holmes, it's easier. Anyways, back to the Dance of Deduction, or Logic and Reasoning Spectacular. This is where Holmes pulls out an absolutely bonkers deduction out of his butt, and Ryunosuke has to come in and fix up the deduction by pointing out the correct object, as opposed to the weird one that Holmes is pointing out. The dance of deduction is incredibly simple for the most part. Usually whatever object you actually need to focus on only requires slightly turning the screen, and at best there's 2 to 3 objects at once, with one of them already being the incorrect one Holmes is pointing out. In terms of visual presentation, however, the dance of deduction is easily the best part of the game. It really shows off the full power of the Ace Attorney series being free from the 3DS. Having the screen spin around, Holmes snapping his finger as a spotlight dawns on the victim, who reacts accordingly, and then Ryunosuke comes in with his own snap as well, switching up the scene. It's definitely the best looking part of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. Sure, the logic itself is very simple, but I think that doesn't take away from how fun it is for the reader to experience it. The second big new gameplay feature is actually a returning one, which is the mob trials, except revamped and refitted as a jury system. Which I say that and you might imagine the jury system from the end of Apollo Justice, but that's something entirely different. Essentially, it boils down to where all the juries will bring up their own statements of why they are convinced the defendant is guilty, and Ryunosuke has to convince them otherwise. While pressing one of the juries, another one might have an exclamation mark, and by hovering over them and commenting on their reaction, you get more information. Parts of this jury system also extend into the cross-examination sections, where there are usually multiple witnesses at a time, as opposed to just one like in previous games. There are a couple of things that I really like about this. The animation of Ryunosuke pacing back and forth on the witness stand is pretty sick. And I think the ability to not just show evidence, but also to compare statements against each other really adds a layer of depth to the whole logic and puzzle solving of the game. It isn't quite as bombastic as the Holmes section, but what it lacks in visual presentation, it more than makes up for by being a bit more complicated. As good as these 2 new gameplay features are, however, what really carries the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, like any visual novel, is the characters and story. This might sound a little strange, but I actually think that having the setting be a completely different time period was a really smart decision on Shu Takami's part, because it finally lets an Ace Attorney game step away from the shadows of Trials and Tribulations and have an entirely new cast. Am I saying this because I dislike the original cast? Absolutely not. I spent the last decade and a half following Phoenix Wright, Maya, Edgeworth, Apollo Justice, and all the rest of the Ace Attorney crew. Like many others, I'm sure, they are the reason that I've continued with the series up till now. The problem, from a story perspective, however, is that these characters have already completed their story arcs for the most part. Phoenix Wright, by the end of Trials and Tribulations, has already gone from being a beginner who didn't even know what a cross-examination is, all the way into a full-fledged defense attorney, which is why when Apollo Justice was introduced, they tried to turn Phoenix Wright into more of a mentor character that guides the new generation, similar to Mia Fey. The problem was that Phoenix Wright is such an iconic character for the franchise, thanks especially to how good Trials and Tribulations was, that people wanted him back. So when Dual Destinies came out, it showed the direction the franchise was taking, where Dual Destinies and Spirit of Justice were both shared protagonist stories, where each of the lawyers would share the limelight. While I really liked this format at first, this quickly led to a new problem where whatever new protagonists that showed up, such as Athena Sykes in Dual Destiny's case, they would easily be overshadowed by the previous main characters, which is probably why in Spirit of Justice, she kinda got pushed back into the background. What I'm trying to get at is that it's much harder for Shu Takami to write good character arcs for protagonists like Phoenix Wright and Apollo Justice, who have already completed their main ones, and it's tough, especially with the new direction the series has been taking recently, to give any new incoming characters the limelight when they have to share it with the fan favorites. So I really like the fact that Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is set during the Meiji period with a completely new cast. I think it makes for a very refreshing experience without the constant thought of, well, where's Phoenix Wright? Of course, new doesn't necessarily mean better, and Great Ace Attorney Chronicles wouldn't be as good as it is if the new cast themselves weren't a fun bunch to be around. What the Great Ace Attorney Chronicle does surprisingly well is that they managed to make both the story and cast be very familiar, but at the same time, still have their own unique personality and challenges. For most of these characters, aside from the protagonist, I won't get too deep into them until the spoiler section. As a heads up, I'll be saying the Japanese names in last name first name order, as I'm just used to it. Naruhodo Ryunosuke takes the spotlight as the main character. Ryunosuke is a surprisingly great main character. While the first time you see him, he seems just like Phoenix Wright in a different era, by the end of Naruhodo's resolve, you can definitely say that Naruhodo Ryunosuke comes into his own. He's got all the mannerisms of his distant descendant, the slamming of the table, the finger pointing, the grimacing glare whenever he encounters an incomprehensible situation. Ryunosuke even starts out with a mentor figure who pursues the first case with him and then ends up dead by the second. As his adventures in Great Britain continue, however, Ryunosuke really grows into his own, not just as a lawyer, but as a young adult making his way into the world on completely foreign soil. Aside from his inexperience, which is just like Wright's during his early days, he comes with his own share of strength and faults unique to himself. His decision to book a trip to Great Britain isn't really due to any sort of good reason, but rather his best friend Asogi Kazuma asked him to join, and like the bro that Ryunosuke is, he decided to stow away on a 60-day boat ride from Japan to Great Britain, a trip that during the Meiji period would be pretty hard to return from. This absolutely ludicrous decision encapsulates Ryunosuke in a nutshell. It shows his greatest strength that Ryunosuke is someone who is willing to do whatever it takes for those he considers dear to him, but at the same time it highlights his biggest weakness, where he really has no confidence in deciding his own life. His subsequent decision to become a defense attorney after Kazuma's death isn't really due to his own drive, but rather out of obligation to his best friend Kazuma, and how he wants to achieve the goal that Kazuma had in coming to Great Britain. Ryunosuke's conflict makes him out to be a very likable protagonist. Watching him come into his own throughout the two games and how it ties into the overall plot is just one of the many small facets that shapes the great final conclusion. Outside of what I just covered, Ryunosuke is just fun to be around in the same way that Wright was. He acts the straight man to an insanity that is everyone else, but at the same time, he also has his own fair share of quirks. Mikotoba Susato acts as the judicial assistant for this game, and manages to carve her own niche compared to previous ones as the straight-laced traditional one, which in of itself is unique because previous game assistants have all been endlessly hyper-energetic, from Burger Fiend Maya, Magician Extraordinaire Trucy, Snaku Munching Emma. Having someone be a much more strict and traditional and punctual person actually makes her unique when you compare her alongside these other crazy wackos. Her more subdued personality is then contrasted with her endless curiosity for gadgets, her fangirling over Sherlock Holmes, and her endless delight at all the strange occurrences that happen around them. Having her be the surprise defense attorney at the start of 2 was really cute, although I might just be saying that because her outfit reminds me of Raido Kuzunoha. The only thing I'd found to be a little much about her was they really want to hammer home the whole Susato takedown thing, where she throws Naruhodo like a judo throw. It feels like they just want to give her a funny quirk to have, and overall just felt very forced. Like whenever things would get too emotional, oh bam, Susato throw. Asogi Kazuma, although he dies after the very first chapter, plays an incredibly similar role to Miyafei, in that he acts as the guiding light for Ryunosuke, teaching him what it means to be a defense lawyer. At the same time, he's also the main character's best friend, and it is that friendship that propels Naruhodo Ryunosuke to Great Britain. Sherlock Holmes is the secondary protagonist of this series. As such a world-renowned character, Holmes is always an interesting figure to adapt. Aside from the fact that he's a detective who solves mysteries, everything else seems to be entirely fair game depending on who's doing the writing. In the case of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, Sherlock Holmes is a goofball detective who lives with absolutely zero regard to anyone else and is able to roll with whatever punches are thrown his way. This personality is undercut by the kindness he shows underneath the mask of supreme overconfidence and absolute persistence in trying to be as annoying as humanly possible. While he acts as the clown, there is no denying his brilliance, especially in the inventions he creates, which are all decades ahead of his time, and which allow Ryunosuke to have access to some very powerful forensic tools. Iris Wilson comes along for the ride as the cheerful genius inventor child, who while supposedly adopted by Holmes, ends up taking care of him most of the time. Her presence here shows more of the pluckiness we come to expect from previous assistants, and helps round out the four-person family that Ryunosuke finds in this foreign land. Finally, to round out the main characters is the primary prosecutor of the duology, Baroque Van Zieks. He is the Reaper of the Bailey, a legendary prosecutor who has earned this infamous moniker by the fact that any defendant in a trial with him has ended up dead, regardless of whether they were deemed guilty or not guilty. Baroque Van Zieks pretty much has supervillain status straight from the beginning. He drinks a wine glass in the middle of court. He dresses like one of the highest of aristocrats, probably because he is one. His outfit looks like Edgeworth's from Ace Attorney Investigations, only way less corny. Like the many others that came before him, it is his ability that pushes Ryunosuke to the limit, and it is his own growth that contributes to the final conclusion. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles does many things, but the one thing it does really well is setting up a grand mystery from the start of the first game that leads into a full-blown climax in the second. What's really great about this style of story is that it gives the Great Ace Attorney 2 much more time to set up. By the second game, all the characters have already been properly introduced and the setting has already been explored, so now the game can focus entirely on blowing up the underlying mystery that has been hinted at throughout every case starting from the beginning. The downside to this though, as I mentioned in the introduction, is that the first game on its own doesn't have the best of conclusions. Unlike Dual Destinies or Spirit of Justice, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles isn't one story split into 5 cases, but rather one story split into 10. As you can imagine, that leads to the first 5 cases playing build up to the latter 5. The last case of the first game is fairly solid. I'd go as far as to say that in terms of difficulty of the actual puzzle solving itself, it does a great job and is definitely one of the harder in the series. It's just not a final case, and it even ends off with a "to be continued," which isn't a problem for this release obviously since it comes with both. If, like me, you end up playing the whole Great Ace Attorney Chronicles back to back, then the filler cases start to drag a lot harder, which in my mind are the 2 Clouded Kokoro cases involving Soseki. All of the setup in 1 finally pays off in 2, when everyone starts to reveal what's going on. Why did Holmes do all of this during the first game? Why this character had to leave during this case? All of that good stuff. A fun trick that the Great Ace Attorney utilizes is not just using previous games' expectations, but also the Sherlock Holmes mythos as a whole to set up similar characters and then turn those expectations on its head. If I was looking to try and find faults with the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, I'd say that the difficulty is on par with other games in the series, in that in the beginning it's ridiculously easy, and later it gets a little bit harder, but not by too much. As I said multiple times already, the first game is a little slow. It more than makes up for it during the latter half of the second game, but it's not like that changes the fact that during the first game, I kinda want it to speed up a little. Investigations are a lot more fun thanks to the dance of deduction with Holmes, but when you actually have to investigate normally, I grew pretty tired of doing it by the 6th case. These aren't as big of issues if you're playing each game individually, however I'm trying to judge Chronicles as a single package since I feel like that was the intended way of playing the game. Luckily, this installment of the game adds in 2 pretty helpful features to alleviate some of this. One was allowing you to start from whatever chapter during any case, which I really liked since I had already played the original Japanese 3DS version way back when for the first game, so I just skipped around the first 4 cases. The other was story mode, which literally just plays the game for you. As in, if you ever have to press a witness, submit evidence, click on a certain spot on the map, the game will just do all of it automatically. You might think I'd batch story mode like, games these days are all so hand-holdy, but I actually really like the feature since you can toggle it on at any moment. I think the game should still be played normally if you can, but there are some times in this series where the game requires you to find an incredibly specific object in the background to continue, and story mode skips all of that hassle. If a player is just completely stumped and is just losing life constantly, then the player can just flip on story mode for that particular problem and then turn it back off. If the player was gonna save and load guess their way through anyways or look it up online, then story mode just skips the middleman. It does disable achievements, but hey, that's why they're called achievements, right? Music's also fantastic, and yeah, I think that's about as far as I'm gonna get without getting into spoilers. If you haven't played any Ace Attorney game before, but was always interested in the concept of a lawyer logic game where you watch wacky characters slam tables and point fingers, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is definitely a fantastic entry point. From a visual perspective, it already blows the rest of the series out of the water, and even from a story perspective as a complete package, it's probably the best game in the series. It's also perfect in the sense that with a completely new setting and cast and story, it requires no prior knowledge of the previous games to fully enjoy. If I were to strictly compare Great Ace Attorney 2 Naruhodo's Resolve to Trials and Tribulations, I'd say that Naruhodo's Resolve might edge it out, and that's with my nostalgia goggles probably fogging my perception quite a bit. Anywho, yeah, spoilers are coming up so I can really get into why I keep on just hyping up the conclusion to the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles duology throughout this entire video.
Somehow we seem to have come to the end of the adventures of Ryunosuke Naruhodo. Or the first volume, at least. Looking back now, it feels as though fate has led me on this journey.
What the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles does best, as I said multiple times, is the setup. The story and characters are all developed slowly over the course of both games, so that by the time you reach the final case, the crazy conclusion feels completely earned. It's not any one character or one reveal that makes the mystery behind the darkness of the British law system so great, but rather the combination of so many factors leading up to it. I like to mention that while I highlight these twists, the reason I think they are great is because they all work in service of the overall story, as opposed for purely for the sake of having an unexpected twist, which some games fall into the trap of. Some are fairly obvious. For instance, the idea that Male Strongheart is the main villain of the duology, which is absolutely not a surprise. The man lives in an office of giant revolving gears like he lives in a clock tower, and then straight up says something along the lines of, "My ideal world is where everyone becomes a cog in a giant machine." It's like, dang, no really? He's a true mastermind? What a shocker. With that said, however, the road leading up to that discovery is absolutely phenomenal. The answer isn't really who is the main villain, but rather, how and why everything is happening in London. Who are the people helping Strongheart, whether consciously or unconsciously, and why are they doing it? It's a spiderweb of motivations, one which at the very center lies Male Strongheart. Pretty much every main character outside of Ryunosuke and Susato are near the very heart of the matter too. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles really goes above and beyond in utilizing the Sherlock Holmes mythos, not just as a cute way to shove Holmes into a game, but also to subvert expectations that we have that comes with that territory, alongside the expectations we potentially have from playing older games in the series. Two of the best examples for this are Inspector Gregson and Asogi Kazuma. Tobias Gregson has all the makings of it being similar to Gumshoe at first, in that he's basically a detective who's trying to be a hard ass and shoo away the main character from every crime scene. But at the same time, he does begrudgingly end up lending a helpful hand towards them. He is also the obvious counterpart to Inspector Gregson from the actual Sherlock Holmes stories. Gregson is portrayed as a blunt and gruff detective who cares about finding the criminals and is just doing his best for the safety of the general public. So in the fifth and final case of the first game, when you find out that he's secretly hindering your case and covering for an obvious villain in order to protect some hidden knowledge from reaching the public, it's kind of a surprise. Gregson has always felt like a pretty upright guy, both in the context of Great Ace Attorney and even the original source material, but here he is perfectly okay with subverting the law in order to protect some great secret. It highlights both the secret itself, like what kind of secret is worth doing such a thing, and how Inspector Gregson is someone who is willing to compromise morally in service of some perceived greater good. This initial hint of Inspector Gregson's true values is just one of the many contributing factors to the final chapter in Resolve, where we find out that while Gregson wanted to see criminals get what they deserved, he was definitely not above any method to do so. The Reaper of the Bailey mythos, which has followed Baroque van Zieks, was not some strange mythical tale, but rather was concocted by Male Strongheart, with Gregson acting as the brains of the operations, planning all the assassinations of the crooked defendants who abused the corrupted justice system to get away from the law. It's like, damn, chip munching Gregson? Gregson who would suck up to Iris because her Sherlock Holmes books that she wrote increased his paycheck? That's the guy who was in charge with this insane vigilantism? It's a great twist because it counters what we come to expect from a character who isn't obviously evil, and the setup leading to it has been shown earlier. Inspector Gregson isn't a bad guy, which is what makes him a great character. He's just doing what he believed was right for the general public, even if it led innocent people being framed and the law left in tatters. This twist of expectations can also be seen in Asogi Kazuma. At first, he plays a role entirely similar to Miyafei in that he's the mentor figure to the main character, who teaches him how to be a defense attorney but then dies off right after, forcing the protagonist to stand on his own, only able to inherit his feelings. Kazuma, just like Miyafei, then acts as a guiding light for Ryunosuke, where when he has his back against the wall and is unsure of his path, Ryunosuke only needs to think back to his words to cement his beliefs. He even says similar stuff like, "Trust is your greatest weapon." This idea of Asogi Kazuma persists from the start of the game, to the end of the first game, all the way till the second to final case of the second game, where it's revealed that Asogi Kazuma has been alive all this time. Holmes only lied that Kazuma was dead in order to make sure he never reached Japan, and that Kazuma's purported reason for going to Great Britain was veiled in a myriad of secrets and lies. While his stated reason in the beginning was to revitalize law in Japan, his real reason is seeking justice for his deceased father, who has become the greatest kept secret in Old Bailey's history. This justice, however, is clouded by revenge and Kazuma's willingness to take down Baroque von Zieks, who he perceives to be the one responsible for his father's death. What's so great about this reveal is that it really shows a lot of character development, not just for Asogi, who becomes much more than just Great Ace Attorney's budget Miyafei, but especially for the main character, Naruhodo Ryunosuke. Ryunosuke's greatest battle isn't necessarily against Kazuma, who has become a prosecutor blinded by his vengeance, or even the main villain behind the scenes, Male Strongheart, but rather it's against his beliefs. All the time he's gotten this far in every case by following the belief that Kazuma has laid out for him from the very beginning, and yet here he is, battling against the same man who seems to have forgotten those beliefs. It's a test of whether Naruhodo Ryunosuke, in the face of all this corruption, of people choosing to look away from the truth, whether it's for the perceived greater good, the inability to stand up against those in power, or because of the emotional weight of guilt shackling them, whether he still has the resolve to stick by these borrowed ideas and make them his own. Can Ryunosuke still have faith in not just the defendant, who used to be his rival, but also in his best friend, who seems to have changed into an entirely different person? Because if by the final case, Naruhodo Ryunosuke still thought of himself as a substitute for Kazuma, he wouldn't have been able to stand against the darkness of the British law system, and would have just deferred to him. Ryunosuke's growth is best encapsulated by how at the end, he's the one teaching Kazuma about the importance of the truth. It's an incredible arc, one which wouldn't have been nearly as good without all the setup that had started from the very first case. I would say the finale of the Great Ace Attorney really starts off during the second to last case of Resolve, or the return of the Great Departed So, which is the third case since the last case is 2 parts. This case is great in that it's where both Ryunosuke and Van Zieks team up in order to discover the truth, showing how important it is, or find their client guilty or not guilty. Already, that was one of the coolest moments in several of the previous games. This is then taken one step further in the final case, with Ryunosuke manning the defense bench and Kazuma on the prosecutor's side, where they root out the true villain, while he is literally standing on top of them as the judge. It is truly an exciting moment, where the player has to question how on earth are they going to get the actual presiding judge. Couldn't he just call it quits and end the case right there and then? This case also got several shining moments, one of which is the final dance of deduction with Holmes and his secretly revealed partner, Mikotoba Eugene. As absolutely cheesy as Eugene's tap dancing is, the actual reveal that Eugene was the secret partner of Holmes all this time was a great one. For one, Great Ace Attorney would have you believe that all the way till now, John H. Wilson, who died in the very first case, was his partner because he has a very similar name to John H. Watson in the original stories, and that's the signature given to Iris, which she takes her surname after. 2. While it was never any doubt that Holmes was always on the good guy's side, Suzato's father Eugene was a lot tougher to say since it was clear he was hiding many secrets. So to suddenly come in and save the heroes at the 11th hour is so dang cool. The final dance of deduction is also that much more powerful, as it's the only one in the game without Ryunosuke there. Overall, Great Ace Attorney 2 Naruhodo's Resolve has one of the best finales in the Ace Attorney series hands down. There's just so much love about it. Sure, there are several stretches of imagination required to get from point A to point B. For instance, the idea that Kazuma, after being dumped as an unconscious corpse in Hong Kong, gets amnesia, then somehow makes his way to Great Britain from a completely foreign country halfway across the globe, or how Holmes invents a hologram technology during the Meiji period in order to corner male Strongheart is pretty insane. But I think that just kinda goes under the general wackiness of the Ace Attorney series as a whole. Outside of all the general improvements to visual presentation that I already mentioned, I also want to highlight that I really like the Part 1, Part 2 game format that they decided to implement for Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. Sure, it's kind of annoying to have to play through the first game of the series, then run into a cliffhanger of sorts, and have to wait a year or so before the release of the next one. Even with that said though, I think the Ace Attorney series massively benefits from being able to have 10 or so cases for the story as opposed to 5 in order to create a truly good climax. The original Phoenix Wright trilogy was pretty much the same in my eyes. Since Justice for All, the second game, didn't really contribute much to the overall story arc. 2 games seems just right in order to establish new characters and set up a proper bonanza of a conclusion. If they potentially take this format to the mainline series, I think a 2-game format would allow whatever new character to have their own story arcs before bringing in all the old fan favorites to create a grand epic. It will give more time for the new protagonists to truly establish themselves without being overshadowed by those that came before. I think I pretty much exhausted all I want to talk about for the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. Honestly, initially I had imagined that talking about this game wouldn't have taken nearly this long, but somehow, while thinking about more and more things I want to say, the script just got longer and longer. I really liked the Ace Attorney series quite a bit, and to finally get a game in the franchise I didn't go, yeah, I guess that was good, but instead vividly remind me of the first time I reached the end of Trials and Tribulations, that really puts a smile on my face. For those of you who haven't played the original trilogy, it might be kinda weird why I keep on comparing this game to Trials and Tribulations, but I think nearly everyone who has played it can agree that the original story arc that came out over 15 years ago was probably the best in the series, and every subsequent game has tried to figure out where the series could go from there. So to finally receive a game that can match up to that or even surpass it, not just by including some admittedly amazing bells and whistles in terms of visual and gameplay upgrades, but by having a fantastic new cast and story, is all that a fan of the series could really hope for. If you enjoyed this probably way too long look at the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, feel free to do all the supportive stuff as usual. Comments are there if you have anything you want to talk about Ace Attorney related, and with that, I'll see you later, till next time.